Okay, folks, so today we're going to be talking about genetics and heredity. So if you have your doodle notes open, you can fill them in. You may not get them all completely filled in while I'm going over this, but that's fine. You can just fill it in some more. I'll post the answer key later on. But so genetics is the study of heredity, which is the passing of traits from parent to offspring. So they are your characteristics, but traits are your inherited characteristics. A table has traits, but a table did not inherit them from anything. Someone made them. So that's really the difference between a trait and a characteristic, is that traits are inherited characteristics. You inherit them from your parents. An example might be the tiger stripes, whether they are wide or narrow. Okay, if we're talking about humans, we're talking about us. We went over some traits the other day. Whether you have an attached earlobe or a free earlobe, one that comes off of your head. Mine's attached. Okay, or you have hair on your fingers, between the digits on your fingers, or you don't. Whether you have a hairline that has a widow's peak, or is it a straight line across? I think mine's kind of straight. See, there we go. Okay. In any case, so how are these traits determined? Well, traits are determined by your genes, and genes are found on your chromosomes. Okay, chromosomes come in pairs. Okay, that means 2 chromosomes to every pair of chromosomes. And that's important because you need to understand that one of those chromosomes came from mom, the other chromosome came from dad. And each of those chromosomes that came from each parent has genes on it, which will determine your traits. And together, both parents' genes will influence each of the traits. This shows you that the chromosomes come inside the nucleus, inside the cells. And we went over how every cell manages to get a full set of chromosomes, and that's because of cell division. And in particular, at the end of cell division, during the end of interphase, the chromosomes double. And then those chromosomes, through the process of mitosis, get divided into 2 new nuclei right before the cell finishes cell division during cytokinesis. And that's how every cell gets a copy of the chromosomes. Okay, and so every cell has a copy of those genes. And why is that all important to know? Well, it's important to know because you need to understand that all of these things are connected. So we look at this picture, this chromosome here. We need to understand that this chromosome has these little colored stripes on it. Well, those little colored stripes are not really stripes, but that's just representing graphically for you that those are your genes. Well, what is a gene really? Well, if you look at this picture, it's showing you that this chromosome, if we were to kind of pull it apart, we could pull out strings of DNA, DNA being the molecule that makes up the double helix structure that has that code in it, and sections of that code that actually give instructions for a trait are the genes. Okay? So just to kind of recap, you've got your chromosome, which is made up of DNA. You've got your gene, which is a section of that DNA that is the code for making a protein. So we learned in protein synthesis that when your cells want to make a protein, they make a copy. So let's say they want to make this gene, which when they do want to make something, it's usually a gene because it codes for a specific trait, whether it's an external trait that you see or an internal trait, which means a functioning of the cell or of the organ or of the body. And so in this case, when you want to make a protein, you have to make a copy of it. The copy goes into the cytoplasm, and the copy then gets picked up by a ribosome, and the ribosome then makes the protein. So if this happens to be a gene for a tiger stripe, whether it be narrow or wide, well, that's the protein that's going to get made. If this was a gene for whether you have hair on your fingers or not, right? One version of the gene might say, hey, make the skin cells produce hair on the fingers. And another version of the gene might say, hey, don't make hair on the fingers. And so that's what actually gets made, right? You can watch this video later at your own pace to see if you want to learn more about genes and proteins and things like that, and you should. Let's talk a little bit more about those colored spaces that you saw on the previous slide, right? You saw the colored spaces, and now we want to find out what these colored spaces mean or why we draw them as colored spaces. And so the reason that they're drawn as colored spaces is because they want you to understand that there are two genes, one gene on each chromosome from two different parents, but they mean the same thing. So for instance, let's say this is this red gene here, right? This red section is the same gene from each parent or code for the same trait. However, there are different versions of a gene, right? So we have a gene for hair in the fingers or not hair in the fingers. Well, if you get the gene from hair in the fingers from mom, but you get the gene for no hair in the fingers from dad, what's your trait actually going to be? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the important thing to understand right now is that there are different versions of the gene. So the gene's hair in the fingers, some genes say, hey, make cells produce hair in the fingers, and other genes say, hey, make cells that don't produce hair in the fingers. There are genes that can say, hey, make an attached earlobe, and there are genes that can say, hey, don't make an attached earlobe, make a free earlobe. But the trait is still for an earlobe, right? So this orange part was for an earlobe. There's two versions. So we call these different versions, we call them alleles. Okay, and so alleles are represented with lower and uppercase letters. So looking at this organism, which has their pair of genes, has two different versions for whatever this red section is. I know that because I see one capital and one lowercase. This person has two of the same alleles in this orange section. They have two capital B's. This person has two of the same alleles in the yellow section, two lowercase c's. And we'll find out in just a minute why we have upper and lowercase letters representing the different alleles. So let's talk about dominant and recessive, and then that will be more clear. So dominant versus recessive. When something's dominant, if you think of sports, if you dominate the other team, it means you beat them pretty good. It means you probably beat them on a regular basis if you're a dominant team over time. So when we talk about genes, we talk about the dominant versus the recessive. The dominant trait will dominate the recessive trait, meaning that it will show itself when it's present. Okay? So for right now, just know alleles can be dominant or recessive. And here's the dominant allele. It will always be expressed when it's present, and it's shown as a capital letter. So a capital A means it's dominant. If I had a lowercase a here, that would be recessive, right? And remember, these letters are not the actual genes. We know genes are the DNA code, but when talking about them, it's easier to just represent them as letters. Like in the last slide, we represented them as colors and letters, right? So in any case, the recessive allele is expressed if two copies of the gene are present. Another way to look at that is the dominant allele is not present. Okay? We know we're going to always have two copies. But anytime there's a dominant copy present, the dominant trait will be expressed. So it makes sense that when the dominant trait is not present, it also means that two recessive alleles will be present. And recessive alleles are always represented by a lowercase letter. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this trait here. The traits for a black coat in a cat. Capital B represents a black coat because it's the dominant trait. Therefore, lowercase b will represent the recessive trait, which is a brown coat. Why we choose B? Probably because black is dominant, so capital B makes sense. All right. So remember the rules. If you have at least one dominant allele represented by one capital letter, the dominant trait will be expressed. If you have no dominant allele present, and the converse is you will then have two recessive alleles present, the recessive allele will be expressed, or the recessive trait, will be expressed. Okay? So let's practice what we just learned. So let's look at this first cat. Please, one finger if you think the cat has a black coat. Two fingers if you think the cat has a brown coat. Everyone vote. Good. You should have said that the cat will have a black coat. Please tell the person next to you why. Good. What you should have said to your partner was that there's at least one capital B, so it's going to have a black coat. Now, what I'd like you to add the next time you talk about it is why, right? So why? So why don't you talk about it now? Why does the first cat have a black coat? Besides the fact that there's one capital B. What does the one capital B mean? The capital B means it has at least one dominant allele. Yes, this cat does have two, and that'll be important later on. But it only needs one to express a dominant trait, okay? Next cat, middle cat here. One finger black coat, two fingers brown coat. Good, again, it has a black coat. Tell the person next to you why. Good, I heard people tell their partner that it has a black coat because one dominant allele is present. Yes, the recessive allele is also present, but whenever the dominant allele is present, the dominant trait will be expressed. Third cat. One finger black, two fingers brown coat. Good, this cat has a brown coat. Tell the person next to you why. Okay, you should have said that this cat has a brown coat because there is no capital B's, which means there is no dominant allele present. And the converse of that conversation is that there are two recessive alleles present, which is the only way you'll express the recessive trait. Okay, nice job at that. So what we want to talk about now is genotype versus phenotype. Genotype almost has the word gene in it. That's how you're going to keep this straight. Gene is Gene. You hear the word starting, genotype. So it pretty much means the type of genes an organism has. Phenotype is the trait expressed, right? So if you can keep genotype with genes you have, hopefully you can remember that the other one's about, well, which traits expressed. And why is that important? Well, as we said, genotype's a genetic makeup, which means it's the pair of alleles. And that's important because you can have different genotypes but have the same phenotype. Remember, you only need one dominant allele to express a dominant trait, but you can have two. So in the case of these two organisms here, right, we have different genotypes, different genes or alleles present. However, this organism would express a trait for a black coat, and so would this organism express a trait for a black coat. Not so important in terms of recessive alleles or having a recessive trait, because if you have the recessive trait, you must have two recessive alleles. Now, we use some different words. So example of phenotype, by the way, we've been talking about hair on the fingers, whether you have an attached earlobe or not. Another example would be eye color. So if you had blue eyes, you have the blue eye phenotype. If you have brown eyes, you have the brown eye phenotype. Then becomes the discussion, well, what's the genotype? And so it's important to go back and talk about a couple of words. If you have two of the same alleles, you are homozygous. The prefix homo means the same, like in homogenized. Homogenized milk. If you look at the milk container, it says homogenized vitamin D milk. That means the milk is mixed thoroughly. It's the same throughout, right? It doesn't settle out. The converse of homogenized is or homozygous has the prefix homo, which means the same. The converse of the prefix homo is hetero, which means other. So another reference that might work for you, if someone's a homosexual, they like the same sex, right? If someone's a heterosexual, they like a different sex, okay? And I tell you that to hope that this sticks when you think of homozygous. There's the prefix homo, which means the same, so the same alleles or the same traits. And then heterozygous, which means two different alleles, two different genes, okay? We also say that someone's homozygous is purebred, someone that's heterozygous is hybrid. So let's go back to this example here. So first we're going to go through and you're going to tell me, you're going to call out, you're going to tell me if it's homozygous, two of the same, or heterozygous. So the first one, everyone. Call it out together. First one, everyone. Homozygous. Good. Say it again. Homozygous. Say it again. Good. Now we got it. Homozygous. How about this one over here? Two of the same alleles again. It's everyone. One more time. Good. Two of the same alleles, homozygous. When you have different alleles, right? Two of the different alleles. Who remembers what it's called? Let's hear it. Good. One more time. Good. So now, I saw some of you get a little confused. This was pretty straightforward. They have two different alleles. You just say heterozygous. But I saw some of you get a little confused between this one and this one because they're clearly very different, but they both have two of the same alleles. So how would someone know what you were talking about? Well, the way you do it is that you specify after the word homozygous what they're homozygous for. So in this case of this organism, there's two dominant alleles, so you would say homozygous dominant. In the case of this organism, you would say homozygous recessive. With heterozygous, it doesn't matter. You don't need to specify. As soon as you say heterozygous, we know that you're talking about the fact that the organism has two different alleles, is heterozygous, and is hybrid. But with homozygous, you have to specify. So let's do this one again, adding those two terms. So what's this organism here, everyone? Homozygous. Dominant. Everyone. One more time. Good. How about this organism? No. Everyone. Come on, everyone. Good. Homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, heterozygous. Very good. I hope you got it because now we're going to practice on these. First organism, capital C, capital C. I need everyone, boys, over here. I need this part of the room too. Next organism. Excellent. That's it. Heterozygous. Next organism. Good. Excellent. Excellent. Good. Perfect. Perfect. Any questions about any of that? Nice job. If you understood everything we talked about today, you understand almost everything you need to know about genetics. Good work.